Welcome to another installment of the Jackson School of International Studies COVID-19 Global Conversation Series. This is a series of conversations with notable actors on the world stage who are responding in some way or other to the global pandemic. My name is Richard Watts. I'm faculty in the Department of French and Italian Studies here at the University of Washington and Director of Canadian Studies in the Jackson School of International Studies. And I'm coming to you from my office at the University of Washington, a very quiet place at the moment. And even though this conversation is happening virtually, both Consul General Lee and I are in fact in place in Seattle, here in the Pacific Northwest. So a land acknowledgement still seems very much relevant. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And I would just add that as somebody who works primarily in foreign languages, that I also would like to acknowledge the languages of the Coast Salish peoples, and in particular, I'd like to mention Lashutzid, which is now being taught at the University of Washington, which is a major step forward in the recognition of indigenous languages. So far, these COVID-19 conversations with researchers and public health officials have given us insights to responses to the pandemic in places such as Uganda, Liberia, Kazakhstan, India, Italy, Germany, and Spain, and even at home. I'd like us to stay close to home here and talk about our neighbors to the north in Canada. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Consul General Brandon Lee, Consul General of Canada in Seattle. Consul General Lee began his career in the private sector, notably in the development of online banking in North America. And he has brought that expertise to the public sector, joining the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade in 2004. From 2007 to 2011, he oversaw reform activities to strengthen Canada's international presence and became the department's first director of innovation. His previous consular posting was in San Francisco, and we were delighted when Brandon moved north in 2017 to assume the post of Consul General here with the responsibility for Washington State, Idaho, Oregon, and Alaska. So Consul General Lee, welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Watts.
So I thought we'd start this conversation by talking about diplomatic work in a time of crisis. And when we first conceived of talking about the COVID-19 crisis and Canada's response to it and your work in response to the crisis, we were focused on one crisis. And another crisis has come to be superimposed in some way on this first one. And we'll wrap up our conversation toward the end by talking about the events surrounding the death of George Floyd and echoes regarding those events in Canada. But let's start by talking about diplomatic work in a time of crisis. And I guess first question would be, how has your work changed since all this began?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I would begin, I guess, by answering that directly. And so our official title, we're the Department of Foreign Affairs, so Global Affairs Canada. But the past few months, well, since almost the beginning of the year, we've been renamed the Department of Consular Affairs. Really, this has been an all hands on deck global activity for all diplomats around the world, for all Canadian diplomats especially. And we've gone through phases actually. So at the beginning, of course, it was making sure Canadians are safe, getting information, getting Canadians signed up to all our various social media and communications platforms. And then a number of us, especially in the US, we were asked to help with the procurement of PPEs for Canada. As soon as we saw that some of our stockpiles would be falling short, a number of us got involved very deeply, integrated into that, and ventilator procurement as well.
Did you develop competencies you didn't know you had in that regard? I don't imagine procurement has been part of your CV up to this point.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, you know, the role of a diplomat broadly is to make sure um, that information and relations remain friendly and collaborative. And especially when countries are all scrambling to make sure they can take care of their citizens, our role becomes even more important.
Yes.
And even in fact, some of some of your viewers may have seen the tensions between Canada and the U.S. around certain shipments being
Yeah.
stopped at the border and repositioned. Um, and so when we, us diplomats, we got on the case to see how we could resolve that. We followed the supply chain, and in fact, most of the fibers that are used to create and fabricate the masks here in the U.S. are coming from Canada, from
Yeah.
British Columbia, in fact. So this is the nature of how integrated our two countries were
Yeah.
and are. And so when we quickly presented that information to our U.S. counterparts, and um, we resolved that issue as a single standalone event in
Yeah.
this large variety of tasks we'd be doing. So then another situation, of course, with the PPE procurement and the fact that we had to make sure that our country of Canada was procuring enough for us to address the pandemic. We of course closed the U.S.-Canada
Right.
border, um, and here being Consul General to the Pacific Northwest, me and my team, we oversee the second busiest border crossing in the entire U.S. Um, but also we have Point Roberts and Alaska, which are unique situations. So
Yeah.
Point Roberts, for those of your viewers, many know that Point Roberts um, residents and students have to cross the border twice
Yeah.
just to receive schooling and certain other services from mainland Washington State. So we made sure that the situation there was reasonable, and also Alaska, from the capital to make it back, there's only one highway, and you have to enter the Yukon territories and
Yeah.
back. So you have to cross the international border twice as well, just to traverse from the capital of the Yukon to the rest of the uh, from the capital of
Yeah.
Alaska to the rest of Alaska.
Can you talk about prospects for reopening? I know that we're very much closely approaching the time when more or less normal service will be resumed.
Absolutely. So um, as we've progressed through this pandemic, I think we're seeing the best strategy is a localized strategy.
Right.
So those areas where rates are lower, to really start opening and re-engaging the economy sooner. But then we've spoken about a few things around the border. So for example, it's a very long border. So as we re-engage both sides, the Canadian and the American side, we both agree that we have to see each of our respective jurisdictions able to reopen in a way that is manageable, that our hospitals don't become overrun,
Yeah.
and that the infection rates are still under control. And with each step of reopening, of course, we expect to see small increments.
Yeah.
We're all watching to see what the recent protests, what the infection rates look like after this, with all of the people
Yeah.
marching together. So before we open the international border, we want to see all of those areas at least reasonably maintained and controlled. And I think today or tomorrow you'll see some more announcements around the border coming out.
Excellent. Yeah, I've been paying attention to how this is happening in France as well, and they're taking a policy that I think many other countries are taking, which is essentially do a partial reopening, wait 3 weeks, examine the data, and then decide on next steps. And it sounds as if that's how things are proceeding with the border.
You're absolutely right. And
Yeah.
in fact, uh, economies and governments were so large. Whenever a decision is made, the time it takes to implement that decision is so tremendous. So
Yeah.
it's easier. Like the financial crisis, the motto then was cut once and cut deep,
Right.
instead of successive cuts. And so the border as well, when we open it, we want to open it and all businesses can start
Yeah.
confidently re-engaging, rather than opening, then closing, then opening, then closing.
Oh, indeed, indeed. And so far, I mean, this is a nice segue into the next topic I wanted us to discuss, which is the overall response in Canada to the pandemic. And then maybe we can drill down a little more deeply on some particular hotspots and maybe some lessons that have been learned regarding outbreaks in those places. So I was just looking at the statistics that have been published by the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. And there's been some change, and I think the numbers will change going forward. So this is kind of a snapshot in time. But as of today, you can say that Canada, among large industrialized nations, lands somewhere in the middle in terms of the virulence of the pandemic. So in terms of observed case fatality ratios, France is the highest at 16%. So 16% of those who are diagnosed with coronavirus end up dying. In Russia, it's purported to be somewhere around 2%, Canada, 8%. As it concerns a statistic that I think is a little more legible, that's just a little more impactful, it's the deaths per 100,000 people. UK is the highest at 61 deaths per 100,000. US is at about 33, and Canada at about 20, in the sixth position among nations that have relatively high rates of infection and mortality. So hard to draw too many conclusions. These data are incomplete. They're constantly shifting. But I guess I would ask how you would characterize the overall response to the pandemic in Canada, and your sense of the effectiveness of government measures regarding the outbreak.
It's a great question, and I think we can unpack and explore this in great detail. And I think in our age of technology today, with the information data we have, we're going to see fascinating studies coming out in the months and years to come. But broadly speaking, I think Dr. Tam, our Chief Health Officer of Canada, said it best in that we have 13 provinces and territories in Canada. And in fact, it's not one, but it's 13 pandemics that we've been fighting in Canada. Because Canada, as most Americans know, we have single payer equivalent healthcare systems, but it's not managed at the federal level. So each province and territory have their own system, and they're very different from one another. So depending on population density, population mobility, the provincial territorial healthcare systems, we've seen 13 different styles and strategies within Canada. But so broadly speaking, if I can say, Canadians, many Americans know we're very kind and polite and nice, except when it comes to hockey.
Indeed.
And when it comes to hockey and basketball, I think you could also say that as well. But we have a Team Canada approach, where when we need to come together as a country, when we invoke even the words Team Canada, we all understand what it means and it resonates. And of course, politics are politics, but within Canada, the political tensions, they melted away, and we've seen some great alliances and collaborations coming from people of opposite political spectrums, but aligned as Team Canada on this. So this is something that I think is a big value of Canadian pride. Another thing I think that I can say, and it's not just because I'm a federal bureaucrat, I work in the federal government, but the Canadian government has been very quick to act and has been very responsive. For example, one of our programs is the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, the CERB, and this is for people who fall outside of employment insurance. And so the Prime Minister Trudeau announced a program, $2,000 every 4 weeks for these citizens. And we launched a website. We had it up and running. The website, there are many articles written. Canadians thought that it was a scam because it took them 2 or 3 minutes and 5 or 6 questions to complete. And then 3 days later, they had $2,000 in their bank account,
Yeah.
electronically transferred. So these are some of the, the indicators that show that government can be nimble and government can be efficient when required.
Yeah. Do you have a sense of how long those benefits are likely to last? Have there been conversations about the duration of this program?
So to answer your question directly, and then maybe make an observation on that is, so right now it's for up to 16 weeks. So we're looking towards, the end of the month, and they may be expanded or extended depending on how the coronavirus rates go.
Right.
But then this is kind of how, broadly speaking, if we take a step back, is our government and Prime Minister Trudeau and the entire cabinet have been extremely attentive and mindful to what Canadians are saying and to where the greatest needs lie.
Mhm.
So Prime Minister Trudeau, he had a daily press conference every day in the morning from his residence, and he was announcing measures and programs to address what we were hearing the day or
Right.
the days before. So of course, businesses, essential businesses, people came first. But then we went into sectors, agriculture sector,
Right.
the aquaculture, heritage, even sports, tourism, energy, programs for, and then we heard about, um, people in abusive homes
Yeah.
being, trapped in isolation in an abusive situation is a nightmare. So then immediately we announced a program to help there. And so, indigenous communities, I know we'll get there in a moment, but there as well, the indigenous culture and the communities are such a different structure to some of the other Western style communities. So um, many programs were announced. So this is the, I guess, responsiveness of the Canadian federal government and provincial governments as well.
Yeah. The social dimension of the Canadian response to the pandemic, I think, is, in comparison to what I've observed here in the US, has been quite striking. And I think that will also inform our discussion of responses to recent events, and we'll get there in a few minutes. You raise a number of issues regarding, that point to differences in the organization at the federal level of, let's say, Canada and the US. We've all been aware on this side of the border, on the southern side of the border, of the very intense disputes and tensions between states and the federal government. And you mentioned some of the tensions that melted away at the time that it was decided there needed to be a kind of Team Canada response to this pandemic. Nonetheless, there have been some, you could say, differential effects in the provinces and different responses. And so I'm wondering, let's talk about two. One is the intense outbreaks in the meat processing industries in Alberta, and then the other are the higher rates of infection, the higher rates of mortality in Quebec province, and notably in Montreal. Is there anything? I mean, some of this can't be accounted for, but in your circles, are lessons emerging regarding these two particular hotspots?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll start broadly to answer directly your very, very good question. Is, I think, like we're seeing in around the world, and especially here in the US, the response and where we're seeing outbreaks and some of the weak spots um, is beneficial in the medium to long term to show us how strong our health and our emergency systems are in Canada, and where our weak points are and weak spots. Um, and so, the meat processing outbreaks, we've seen them here, and of course I believe you're referring to the Cargill
Mm.
outbreak. So it's a factory of 2,000 workers, and 949 employees tested positive, with 2 deaths. And from that, a total of 1,560 cases of COVID have expanded. And so this shows that, there's different ways of managing, and uh, uh, you know different organizations, not criticizing Cargill, but there are different, you know mass plant structures that perhaps need to look and revisit at how they respond in this type of pandemic crisis. um, and also you quite rightly pointed out what's happening in Quebec and in Montreal, where well over half the deaths in all of Canada are within the province of Quebec. Um, and then there, I think the premier of Quebec, in one of his remarks, said it accurately, in that in Quebec it is a terrible outbreak and it's very severe, but there's two realities. There's one reality happening in um, senior homes,
Right.
and that ecosystem, and then outside of that ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so even there, I think we need to really look at, um, you know, some of your viewers may have seen that it got to a point where the outbreaks in the senior homes, the senior care facilities, got so challenging for workers, that workers stopped showing up, or workers, they themselves got sick. And so who do you have to come in? And so both in Quebec and Ontario, um, we had to deploy military service members during the months of April and May to over 2 dozen nursing homes to help with the shortage, because there wasn't enough staff to take care of the people in these homes. So
Yeah.
this is clearly another area that we really have to focus on and do a lot better moving forward.
Right. And I think that's a lesson that was learned in Washington State as well, where at least initially, a very high number of the cases and high percentage of the deaths were in fact in long-term nursing care facilities. And I think so. There's much to be learned by comparison. There's probably also a lot to be learned um, through contrast. And there are the specific actions that you've described that have been taken by the federal government to try to attenuate some of the worst social and health effects of the pandemic. There's also, you mentioned the Prime Minister's daily news conferences. And I'd be remiss if I didn't ask at least one question about a contrast in leadership style. Um, and I'm thinking here, and this brings us a little bit closer to a topic I want to keep for the end. But I was thinking about Prime Minister Trudeau's 21 seconds of silence in relation to, in response to a question about the Trump administration's response to protests, not so much related to the pandemic. So could you say a few words about how you see perhaps a contrast in leadership style without stepping outside of diplomatic norms for these sorts of descriptions?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I've had several conversations around the exact same topic. And I think we have to, because politics is so hot right now,
Yeah.
and any family member or friend, it's really about politics. It gets to politics, all these crises. It gets to a political lens eventually, and the pandemic, and it's so emotional that I think, um, you know, a function of diplomacy, but also just generally an observation, I think, is, as much as people like to point the finger at somebody or someone or an institution, Canada, perhaps the style of politics, is sharply contrasted from what we see in what's happening broadly in the U.S. But it's not isolated to the US. Canada, we have really, really challenging prejudice, really deep discrimination. Um, and so I think this is where Prime Minister Trudeau uh, was right to be thoughtful and mindful about what's happening around the world. And perhaps there was an incident that happened in Minneapolis to instigate this reflection and this outrage. But um, we're certainly not exempt. And in fact, I think the African American or Black population in the U.S. Of course, in Canada we have discrimination, but if we look at the Aboriginal Indigenous cultures in Canada, they've received tremendous discrimination and violence uh, within their own country of Canada.
Yeah, I think it would be useful to hear about, in a first instance, the federal government's response and provincial government responses to what you referred to in an earlier conversation as the threat of accelerated cultural loss during the pandemic as it concerns First Nations and Indigenous communities.
You're absolutely right. So very early on, when we're having our initial strategic conversations around Canada's response, we immediately went to thinking about our Indigenous communities. Um, so many communities, it's truly a communal style of culture. So many generations sharing a single home, and even the lifestyle, it's working together and seeing many people throughout the day, family and friends, versus sometimes in Western culture, the number of people who live in high-rise condos don't know the name of their next door neighbor in their own condo building. But I think the First Nations Indigenous communities are structured much more holistically in that way. Um, and then the heritage from their cultural traditions to languages, it really rests on the seniors and the elders, the wise people of their communities. Um, and maybe a good example is there's a community in British Columbia, the Halsuk tribe, and there are only 30 fluent speakers of the Halsuk language currently in existence. And all 30 are over 75 years old. So this is the urgency with which we thought we really need to protect our Aboriginal First Nations, because it's Canada's cultural heritage also at stake, and not just people's lives, but thousands of years of the Hausuk tribe, their entire language rests on these 30 fluent speakers.
Mm.
So it's this type of urgency. So the number of programs we've launched in Canada and the Prime Minister has announced just to protect this cultural heritage um, has been of great importance to us.
Yeah, no, that's really very important. I want to ask a related question that takes us a little bit outside of pandemic response and pandemic politics, to thinking about how the protests around the death, the presumptive murder of George Floyd have echoed in Canada, and there have been all kinds of very heartening expressions of solidarity coming from north of the border. But I'm thinking specifically of very strong statements of solidarity that I've heard being made by urban Inuits, and actually not just urban Inuits, but maybe primarily from that particular group, who seem to express a very strong sense of identification with the objectives and, frankly, the methods of Black Lives Matter. And this can seem a little bit disjunctive, but can you understand, perhaps, or maybe try to explain to people who are watching this why that echo might exist and what it's the expression of?
Mm. And on this, even myself, uh, resonating personally with Indigenous the Indigenous and First Nations challenges in Canada. There's so much to unpack and such a deep history of pain within Canada. Um, and so, as we had just mentioned, what's happening here in the U.S. with Black Lives Matters, it resonates deeply across Canada for all visible minorities, um, uh, people that have received discrimination. But I feel it resonates especially with our Indigenous First Nations, because here in the U.S. it's really about it's a much bigger issue around systemic and institutionalized discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
from police systems to legal systems and broader. And if you look in Canada from the forced uh, systems that we've oppressed the Indigenous First Nations with in Canada, family separation to forcing uh, 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 them to establish themselves. The natural tribal communities are nomadic, but it was the Canadian government who forced them to settle in one place, um, which which causes a lot of problems when if you had to travel with the seasons and the migrating herds and where plants grew, then to forcing yourself to stay in one place and enduring winters and hardships, which was not part of your culture. So it just has hundreds and hundreds of years of oppression within Canada as well. So maybe I'll share one story. We had a senior strategic retreat, and Prime Minister Trudeau was in attendance for a portion of it. And he was asked, um, as Prime Minister, what would you like your personal legacy to be? And we were talking about everything from international trade to trade agreements to the environment to climate change, um, and the Prime Minister was quite thoughtful about it, and he came back and he said that he would like actually to be known as the Prime Minister to begin the healing of the Indigenous and First Nations people in Canada. And he went on to unpack that to say, and he's fully aware that he cannot be the one to actually heal because it's been so many years of hurt that he can only begin the healing process. Um, and so there are expressions. Perhaps, if I may, I'll even
Yeah.
unpack that a little bit further. And so, uh, anyone who's been following politics and the Prime Minister in Canada, he has spent a lot of time with tribal leaders and elders and Indigenous communities. And one of the messages that came is that if you truly want to heal, you must apologize first. Like between a fighting couple, if you don't apologize, how can you just move on? There has to be that acknowledgement, of regret for the actions of the government. And so at the United Nations, this is a few years back, it was actually when it was Prime Minister Trudeau's first um, address of the United Nations. And most heads of state take that time to boast about how great their country is and how tremendous their own contributions are to their own country. And so we listen to every head of state give that address. And Prime Minister Trudeau, he was criticized by some who didn't understand the full story because his address at the United Nations in front of the entire world was apologizing to First Nations and apologizing for the treatment in Canada. And so a lot of people thought it's not the sign of strength. You cannot apologize. But in fact, the way I see it and the way many people who understand the whole context is, I find that an extremely confident and powerful action of Prime Minister Trudeau, um, to publicly acknowledge what happened and to allow the space for this healing process to begin. He even went to the United Nations and did it there with his first ever address.
And I think that is, in these very complicated times where you can say that the pandemic has acted as a kind of accelerant to highlight and, in some sense, create the conditions for the expression of very long-standing hurts and oppressions. That is, I'll count that as a hopeful note. And maybe in all of these times of great difficulties, ending on a hopeful note is not the worst thing that we can do. So with that, Consul General Lee, I want to thank you so much for your generosity and your time and your insight. I think there is really a study in contrast with our neighbors to the north, and I think there's a lot that the U.S. can learn from the Canadian response, both to this pandemic and to long-standing historical inequities. So again, thank you on behalf of the Jackson School of International Studies and the University of Washington more broadly. We really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Dr. Watts. It was my pleasure, and I look forward to collaborating with you again in the future.
Great. Thanks so much.